Hello, I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome to Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Today, we talk about the trends in alcohol distribution that may threaten the lives of Iowans. Cocktails to go and underage alcohol servers threaten to spark a growth in alcohol abuse problems. University of Iowa researcher Paul Gilbert shares a look into the numbers and the reasons we need to be careful before unintended consequences trend in the direction of harm to more Iowans. Let's meet Associate Professor Paul Gilbert from the University of Iowa. Paul, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you do, and maybe lead into some of the newer legislation.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about these topics. Now, my main research focus is alcohol use, and I try to look at the population at large, so the state of Iowa or even the nation at large, trying to understand the trends, the patterns, where do we see people drinking to excess, what are the problems associated with drinking, and how do we promote recovery when folks have an alcohol problem, the different pathways to treatment or 12-step groups or other ways to recover. And one of my recent projects was working with the Alliance of Coalitions for Change, so a network of really county community-based prevention coalitions. We're working with them to understand the impact of some recent changes in alcohol availability in Iowa just over the last couple of years. So what started in the first year of the pandemic, we had increasing availability through home delivery of alcohol, curbside pickup from stores, and drinks to go from bars and restaurants. And we'd never had that before. So I undertook a project in partnership with them, and it was really a sort of citizen science project to just understand what was happening with this. And since that time, in the last legislative session, the one that just wrapped up this year, we have seen further changes in alcohol availability or the general environment around alcohol. And probably the most notable change was the bill allowing minors now to serve alcohol. So if they were working as say a server in a restaurant, they could serve alcohol now down to 16 years old, I believe. And that again is a change, that something that we had never had before in Iowa.
Yeah, we look at that. I mean, I think that's one of the things that stimulated this discussion. One, the problem with open containers and drinking in cars, because drinking and driving is a very deadly combination. Nobody will argue with that. Even drinkers know this.
Yep.
And the other one is getting more and more younger children involved because they're involved in delivering alcohol, not just by car or other delivery services, but also now working behind the bar in a place. There are some supervisory and oversight things. We all know how chaotic a bar environment is. And, you know, that's two things that we worry about is primarily the greater exposure of youth to substance use disorder, and then the exposure of especially young boys and young girls to what might happen in situations where we have a lot of people using alcohol that are much older, and how the environment could quickly turn difficult or predatory. I mean, you know, our delivery people that can be 16 years of age or older, and our people working behind the bar, based on the research you're seeing, number one, influencing the amount of alcohol out there and the consumption, and secondly, are they personally now going to be at risk in time? Are the unintended consequences going to unearth some darker potentials that we prefer to avoid? I mean, there was a reason that you had to be 21 for a long time to walk into a bar that served alcohol. There were reasons for what we might call prohibitions to keep kids safe. Along with delivery, open alcohol, and younger servers, those barriers seem to be coming down. What are your thoughts?
So you're absolutely right. There are, in my mind, two broad concerns. One is underage drinking and increased access to alcohol. We know, based on all our years of studies of physical development, the brain's development, that alcohol exposure to adolescence and even into young adulthood is dangerous. It affects the development of the body. It has really long-term effects that we're just now understanding, that things that might not show up for decades. So it is a big concern that with, say, home delivery of alcohol, if we're not careful, that could increase underage youth's access to alcohol. For example, there's been reports from other states when they adopted this that, you know, packages were simply left on front porches if nobody was at home to receive it, or somebody may be at home to answer the door, but do they check the ID to make sure the person receiving it is the person who ordered it and is of age to buy alcohol? But also this most recent change of allowing adolescents, teenagers to serve alcohol, say in restaurants, that is a concern because we know that it can be very difficult for a younger person to refuse service to an older person, that at that developmental stage, they're still working out, there's still some growth to do in terms of, say, judgment and decision making. And there's a lot of pressure from, say, near peers. That, in fact, is one of the main sources of alcohol for underage minors, is somebody who is of legal age or looks legal age and can purchase and then share the alcohol. And, you know, it just sets up a really bad, difficult situation for young folks to try and navigate an adult environment when they may not be mature enough or equipped enough or have the support to do it safely.
Well, we're going to take a short break and continue our conversation with Dr. Gilbert. And Dr. Gilbert, I'd like to get into this idea of what do you think the impact might be of both cocktails to go and younger servers in terms of numbers? You're a researcher and they matter. We'll see you all after the break. Stay tuned.
Malware and bots and worms, oh my. The wild, wild web can be a scary and complex place. And as our digital world expands, so too are the threats. Watch out, Trojan horse. That's why at Mediacom, we take security very seriously and monitor our networks around the clock to stop threats before they can affect you. Not today, Rude Kid. Not all internet is created equal. We build ours to keep you connected and protected.
If I could go back and change it all, I would. I think I'm gonna miss you the most. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Maybe it's just the little moments. If I could go back and change it all, if I could go back, I would. But I can't.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and we're talking with Dr. Paul Gilbert from the University of Iowa, an expert in issues related to alcohol. And today, we're focusing on the impact on youth and some new legislation and changes in distribution models throughout the state of Iowa. Paul, continue us. Show us what some of these numbers are. What are we seeing?
Well, that is a great question, the numbers, and that's what we want to see. It's going to take us a little time to get good numbers. These changes just went into effect. And typically the way that we keep track of what's happening in the state and of course across all the US is some of our regular surveillance surveys. So we do the Iowa Youth Survey here in Iowa, specifically with 6th, 8th, and 11th graders in school. We also have every year the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance Survey that's run through the CDC, takes place in all the states, but it takes a while. So the data will be collected, say this year, it takes a while to get it compiled, analyzed, and we might not get the reports until say early next year or a year or so from now. But we'll be watching it to see, do we see an uptick in youth saying that they have drunk? The things that we look for, especially with underage drinkers, is simply any drinking. We ask them in the last 30 days, have you had any alcoholic beverages? Or if they have, then we go a little bit further and ask typically, how many days did you drink? On how many of those days did you have, say, 4 or more, 5 or more, depending on sex for girls or boys. That's the definition of a binge episode, a high quantity occasion of drinking. But remember, any drinking is dangerous for adolescents because they're still developing, growing. The brain is still developing. So we don't want to see any alcohol consumption by underage minors. It will, however, take us probably a year or two to start seeing any changes or be able to tell what's happening. There's a bit of a lag, unfortunately. But I will tell you, I mentioned earlier on, one of my recent projects with the Alliance of Coalitions for Change was a citizen science project to understand what was happening with the home delivery and drinks to go and curbside pickup. And we did a small study recruiting people from the community to basically make observations, folks who were already drinkers, and these were adults of legal age. If they were already drinkers, we asked them to try one of these new methods and just report their observations. We had a standardized form that we had everyone fill out. And although it was a small scale project, what we saw was that each type of delivery, the home delivery, the drinks to go, and the curbside pickup, all had some concerns or problems to varying extents, mostly around how the alcohol was delivered. So if somebody came for a curbside pickup, was the alcohol placed in the driver or passenger area of the vehicle, which we don't want to see it within arm's reach of a driver, or was it placed in the trunk or behind the passenger area, say. We also saw some problems with inconsistent ID checks. So that is, of course, a concern to regulate, make sure that underage folks don't get access to alcohol. But all of this to say, I think the big takeaway is that we're making changes pretty quickly, and we don't understand what's happening. And really, this small scale project, very limited, but it's the only data that we have so far on the process of this, what's happening. And we did get some, I think, useful information. Probably one of the most problematic areas too was the drinks to go, getting an alcoholic beverage to go from a restaurant or bar. The Alcoholic Beverages Division set up regulatory rules, procedures for how things should be sealed and labeled, and we heard reports of things, people coming away with essentially, Slurpee containers with straws, and that was not compliant with the regulations. We want things clearly labeled, that it's an alcoholic beverage with a tamper-proof seal. So we've got work to do.
Now, we've heard a lot of complaints from bar owners that this is too complicated, too difficult, but I have two questions. Ones that interest me. We know so much about the risks of alcohol. You would think, and that this is an opinion, that we would research the potential effects first before we change the regulations, as opposed to like throwing the regulation out there and seeing what goes on. How do you feel about that as a researcher?
You're absolutely right. That would be the ideal. And that's my goal, is I get to do the research, produce data, and that should go to making well-informed, well-educated, sound decisions. That's the ideal. But the reality is, a lot of times we make changes, policy changes to the Iowa Code, and we may not have thought through all the consequences. We may not have the data yet. So that's a risk. So we're playing a little catch up in some of these areas. You mentioned the burden on, say, restaurant or bar or hospitality industry. I actually think that there may be a good case, and I hope they would agree, that we want to bring people into bars and restaurants and keep them there rather than sending them away with drinks. Bring them in, they're likely to spend more. We can monitor them better, not overserve them, make sure that they're safe. It actually might be better for everybody involved, including the business owners.
Well, that's a great point. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back to continue the discussion about the changing boundaries of access to alcohol in Iowa and the potential consequences. See you all after the break. You don't want to miss this.
You told me not to cross the street without looking both ways.
You told me not to touch the stove.
You told me not to do drugs.
You told me not to drink and drive.
You gave me so many messages about how to stay safe. Why didn't you keep me safe by properly storing your gun?
The fact is, we use the internet for almost everything we do. Smart cage, feed beaker. So when the internet doesn't work the way it should, you don't work the way you should.
Kevin!
That's why more homes and businesses rely on Mediacom. Our fiber-powered network delivers 99.99% reliability. And with 650,000 miles of fiber, we have more paths of connection and more ways to avoid outages. Not all internet is created equal. We build ours for you to rely on.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're with Dr. Paul Gilbert, a researcher and expert with a penchant for uncovering unintended consequences of alcohol policy and legislation. You know, I'm going to lean back on some maybe Iowa folk wisdom that you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. So, I mean, sometimes, obviously, if you create more access, more people are going to use, but maybe not. I don't know. Why are we having this conversation? What are the consequences?
Well, you know, that's a great observation. And this is one of the driving concerns, that the more alcohol is available, the more people will drink. Not all people will drink to excess, but the more drinkers, the more you're going to have that proportion of folks overindulging, drinking to excess. And, you know, we all know the harms from alcohol, from the short term, you drink too much, you're sick the next day, to the long-term harms, developing dependence, and everything in between, car crashes and violence and fights. And we're all well aware of that. And at the same time, alcohol really plays a central role in so much of our social lives, that we gather around it. We use alcohol to toast, to mark all our major life events, births and weddings and graduations, retirements, deaths. It really has a central role. And there's a funny duality there, that it's so important to us, and we all know that it can cause so many harms. But one of the things that we do know from the data that is quite concerning is that deaths associated with alcohol use have been increasing in Iowa over the last 2 decades. And in fact, the Iowa Department of Public Health convened a special group to develop a report summarizing this emerging trend. Now, a lot of that we saw happening in the middle-aged and older groups, that their drinking seems to be increasing as they age. And that's also a concern, because as you get older, because of physical changes, you metabolize alcohol differently. You might have interactions with drugs, other health conditions that come up that make it more risky to drink, or at least to continue drinking at high levels. But we're also concerned about setting up a new generation on that sort of dangerous pathway, that trajectory towards drinking. If we expand alcohol access, if we make it easier for young folks to get alcohol, we don't want to set up a heavy drinking career, a heavy drinking trajectory that then will have more people being hurt or possibly dying from their alcohol use. And, you know, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are a lot of long-term effects, things that don't show up for decades. We know that heavy alcohol use earlier in life increases, well, of course, risk of dependence later, but also things like increasing your risk of stroke, dementia, other sort of cognitive decline, heart disease. Contrary to what we thought starting in the 80s, red wine is not protective against heart disease. And in fact, it increases your risk in some ways of high blood pressure, stroke, other forms of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, we look at around in our communities and neighborhoods, even Iowa and small towns, we have areas that don't have grocery stores, don't have pharmacies, but rare is there a place where you can't purchase alcohol. It's in every grocery store, gas stations, it's ubiquitous. And alcohol is really getting to the point now. It takes a long time, but it's replicating sort of the path that cigarettes took, where people are starting to realize that alcohol is just bad for you. That no matter what the benefits might have been in the TV commercials, in fact, alcohol is not a healthy thing to do, just like smoking is not healthy. But the power of both the marketing, the accessibility, and now this sort of, to use the word twice in one segment, this penchant of legislation to free up the whole process of distribution to make it even more accessible to take down those boundaries.
Mhm.
What do you think really is it just pure money and greed that drives this?
Well, I wouldn't say it's that. I do think that, we have this central place for alcohol in our social world. So it's still important. People still think it, yeah, plays this role. And Iowa as a state and the Midwest generally are heavy drinking areas. So we're above the national average in terms of alcohol consumption. Um, but that said, the impulse, I think, when this started, when we changed the Iowa code to allow greater access, and we were not the only state, there are many other states that did this. The impulse in the first year of the COVID pandemic was to help struggling businesses in the hospitality industry. So that was all well-meaning, that was good. But I think we may have overcorrected. And in fact, I do think that a lot of restaurant, bar, other, businesses would much rather have their patrons in the on premises, staying there. Certainly, if you're going to order a drink, often you order food. You can monitor how much they're being served, how they're handling it. And it's just generally a better idea.
So it couldn't be too much of a good thing. Well, we're going to take a short break and we're going to ask Dr. Gilbert to share some final comments, insights, and inspiration. Things you really need to hear. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.
Watching MC22 is now easier than ever before. All MediaCom customers can watch local programming online anytime. Go to mc22.net, click Watch MC22, and log in with your MediaCom account. Not a MediaCom cable subscriber? MediaCom internet or phone subscribers can watch too. Your local programming leader, MC22, online at mc22.net/watch.
I don't remember how it started.
Go to that.
Oh boy.
Our back and forth. It always came back.
Dad!
You probably don't remember what you told me,
That was perfect.
but I heard every word.
Welcome back. Today on Surviving Bad, we're talking about trends in alcohol distribution in Iowa that may threaten the lives of Iowans. Let's see what insights our guest, Dr. Paul Gilbert, has to share. Paul, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I like to say often is everybody's going to be better off if the folks among us who are drinkers just dial it back a little bit, just cut back a little bit. Now, granted, no alcohol use is the safest route. And there are certainly some people that we don't want to see them drinking, like I talked about, underage minors, pregnant people, folks with conditions, maybe medical conditions or drug interactions where it's not safe and we don't want to risk that. But because we are a heavy drinking state, just if everybody took a step back, decreased their consumption a little bit, if they are a current drinker, that would benefit us all. And individual people could make a pretty small change, and all together it would have a big effect. If you think of each person had 1 or 2 fewer drinks per week, if you count that up over all the hundreds of thousands of drinkers across Iowa over a year, that's a pretty big impact. The other thing I'll say is that we know a lot about how to protect people from alcohol's harms. There's been a lot of work on all the different ways, from regulating when and where we sell alcohol to who can buy it and consume it, and things like safety checks, maybe roadside checks, sobriety checkpoints, things like that. There's a whole set of recommended policies and practices to help reduce the harms from alcohol. I can't tell anybody what one to pick, one or the other, but if folks want to Google it or look it up online, it's called the Community Guide. It's a resource compiled by the Centers for Disease Control, and they put together basically a short issue brief with information on, this is the set of, I think it's 8 or 9 recommended policies and practices that can help protect the community from excessive alcohol harms. So that's nice to have, because these are all based in the evidence, they've been researched, and it gives us kind of like a menu to choose from. What's going to fit in Iowa or in our community? What could we do? And it's a whole range of different approaches. My job, my part of that, is to keep doing the research and studying the patterns of drinking. Do we see things going up and getting worse? Do we see consumption trending down or harms decreasing? What's happening with alcohol-related deaths? Up, down, staying the same? That's my job, to help continuously monitor that so that we know what's going on.
You know, there's an interesting aspect of what you mentioned earlier, and that's the concept of citizen science. You know, we know that sometimes good, long, longitudinal research studies can take years, if not decades, to come up with solutions. In the meantime, people die or get sick and bad things happen. But this era of citizen science seems to be growing because of the technologies we have available, because of the engagement. What can you tell us about that? Because that's sort of a new concept.
It is new. Well, I guess maybe not new, because we've always had community engaged research, but maybe it's moving more into the mainstream or getting more attention. I think it's a fantastic development because it gives us more real data, real world data, rather than what I might learn in the ivory tower of the university in my tightly controlled study that takes years to do. And it's so oftentimes feels so detached from people's real lives. And this is a way to make that connection. I or any colleague of mine could bring our scientific expertise, and our community partners bring that real world lived experience, the real deal and the immediate data, the more immediate impression of what's going on. So I think whenever we get a chance to do something like that, to bring community members into our research endeavors, I think it's going to be better.
Yeah, I think you're right, because we also know the impact of the tragedies are really powerful in the communities. There's no amount of research that can, absolve the grief of a community with a traffic fatality or any other incident that might be accompanied with that. So I really thank you very much, Paul. I thank you for your work. I hope people check the links on the show if they're interested in getting more information, because God knows there's a lot of information. We thank you all for watching us today, and check out our website, ahealthyiowa.org, and keep your eye on MediaCom MC22 for our next episode of Surviving Bad, where we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration on MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.